we're just thinking the first two lines expressing our refuge, and the second two lines are basically saying, but by the virtue of listening to these teachings, may we become a Buddha, and doesn't matter how long it takes, so that we can be a benefit to others. So thinking like that. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gi personam ki drola penchir sangye drupa shok sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gi personam ki drola penchir sangye drupa shok sangye charang soke chognam la Jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gi personam ki drola penche sangye drupashok. Okay, so this topic, dependent arising, as paraphrasing Lama Yeshe, quoting Tsongkhapa, the king of logics, as he would say, to prove emptiness, is of course on the, as far as the Lam Rim is concerned, it's the final stages of practice. It's right at the end and in the Bodhisattva path, And so, of course, that means, if we were studying anything and at the end stages of a course, obviously that all the earlier stages would help you understand those final stages. I mean, we can talk about dependent arising and emptiness. We can leap straight into that and discuss it. But it's really, I find it very helpful to look at it in the framework of the entire Lam Rim, in the framework of the earlier teachings. So in other words, if you're at university or you're going to school and you're studying math, but your long-term goal is to study physics, well, then physics is sort of like dependent arising and emptiness. But you wouldn't go straight into physics. You'd have to learn all the basics first, wouldn't you? It's really obvious. It's the same with any body of knowledge. And I know that we know that when it comes to bodies of knowledge, but we're not used to thinking that when it comes to a spiritual path. We can't kind of get that, But it's extremely helpful to understand the whole framework, in other words, the Lam Rim, and how all of it leads us to dependent arising and emptiness. Everything is preparing our mind for it. And so also it can even be, so for example, so let's look at then the Lam Rim and how it really leads us to, really prepares our minds so that we're ready to hear about dependent arising and indeed all the other logical arguments that we need to think about and study and meditate on in order to realize emptiness, which is, when combined with bodhicitta, is the meaning of Buddhahood, is what we achieve when we become enlightened. So, so the very first level, as we know, as we know, this Lam Rim, this stages of the path, it's the main one we study, of course, is from our lineage, Lama Tsongkhapa in the 14th century, and there are multitudes of commentaries on on his teachings alone. But that teaching in turn, as we know, is a commentary on a teaching by Atisha in the 11th century, who first came to Tibet and then stayed on there for the remaining years of his life. And he put together this little text, I think it's called Lamp That Will Guide You on the Path or something. And it's just a series of verses, and it outlines all these stages, because it seems very glib and very condensed, hence we need these commentaries, And so I know when I first heard the teachings from Lama Rinpoche, I didn't know it then, of course. I had no idea. I was going to this Tibetan Buddhist thing. I'd never heard of Tibetan Buddhism, but I went to this course. I didn't know it was the Lam Rim. I didn't know what the Lam Rim was. But all I knew is I was very confused. I had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, so I think in our culture, we have all these very kind of cliched concepts of what we think being a Buddhist is, So for 1 month, I sat there. I was very confused. I couldn't get my head around the information I was hearing. Part of me, I knew it was what I wanted to listen to. I knew this was my path, but it was extremely confusing. And I think part of that is because the way it's presented is talking to the choir. I mean, there it is, basically presented as if you're in the 14th century. And that's what's, I think, interesting. When Padmasambhava first went to Tibet, 7th century or something, and they created their philosophical language. They created an alphabet and created a language specifically for the teachings, you know. So basically, when I heard those teachings from Lama Zopa many years ago, he was speaking as if he were speaking in the 10th century, 9th century, 14th century. It would have been the same. So therefore, the framework and the constructs and the ideas, they would have been very familiar with. So, you know, so for example, karma. When we hear about karma, when they talk about karma, they're talking to people who already accept it as a given, you know. But for us, it has to be completely different how we present it, because we're coming from a completely different view. We're coming from the view of a creator, or indeed we're coming from the view of being a materialist, you know. So they're completely different philosophical views. So we hear karma in a very weird way. So all of the path, of course, is presented like that. Nothing wrong with it. We can get used to it like anything. It's just a language. But it's kind of really, it's hard for us to hear, and I've certainly found that in the beginning. What does it mean, gradual path? Why am I hearing about karma first? Because that seemed to me just as complicated as emptiness. It seemed just as complicated as anything else. It didn't seem like it was stages, you know? And so anyway, that takes time for us to really understand that. Because basically what the Lama is a teacher took the main points from this, in fact, vast body of knowledge, stretching back a couple, even at that point, 11th century, that's what, it's 1,000 years ago, isn't it? 1100 to 2100. It's 1,000 years ago. So they were stretching back another 1,000 before that. Wasn't at the time of the Buddha, more than that. And so this vast body of knowledge that had been cultivated, especially as His Holiness always tells us, where the Nalanda tradition, from this amazing monastic university system back in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century in India, all the greatest scholars and yogis and saints whose knowledge we use, who Tsongkhapa based his knowledge on, comes from those people. What he did was he took the essence of all those, you know, of all that body of knowledge, took the information about the essential points, and he presented them in an orderly way, orderly according to your capacity to internalize them, but also experientially. So, you know, it's presented in a very experiential way, according to the capacity. So if you take one individual student, then it's sort of like, that's why I like to call it junior school, high school, university, and postgraduate. Always like that. I like to use that concept. It mightn't be exactly accurate, but it's a really good analogy because we understand that. We know very well when you're studying any body of knowledge, I mean, you mightn't use junior school for math all the way, but you know it means it's levels of knowledge, and each one, awareness of the first one depends upon the ability to do the second one, and so on and so forth. That's exactly the way it is, you know, in this presentation of the Dharma, of the philosophical points from the experiential point of view. So initially hearing it all, if you hear about karma, there's nothing evident there to us that's helping you understand dependent arising unless you spell it out, you know. If you look at this, that's in the very first of that's what I call junior school. Rinpoche very correctly refers to it using the proper Tibetan terminology as the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability. I mean, it's quite a mouthful. Junior school, good enough, you know. Then you got the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the middle capability, and then the great capability, and then you finally got, if you like, and that's what junior school, high school, and university I like to use, and then you finally got postgraduate, and that really is the Vajrayana, that's Tantra. So it sort of fits very comfortably, it fits very nicely. So okay, the essence. So the essence of the pieces of information in the first of these three, and sometimes we refer to the first scope, low scope, middle scope, great scope. Rinpoche doesn't use that term. He prefers to use lower capable being, middle capable being, great capable being, which is not very pleasant to our ears. It sounds rather quaint. But you know, the teachings of the very first level. Okay, so another way to divide it all. So that's the three scopes, the three levels. So you could say the first two are really, and this is how they say it, are the teachings and practices that we share with The Hinayana path. So, of course, the one that's the one that we mostly of the Hinayana teachings, that whole broad body of knowledge, we refer to the Theravadan teachings. You could say, I think it's true. When I first studied Buddhist tenets, they lay out all these different schools of thought. I think the Theravadan one is the only remaining of the 18 sub-schools of one of the Vibhashika or the Satantrika. I can't remember which. There's two main areas in the tenets of the Hinayana teachings. There's the Vibhashika and the Satantrika. And I can't remember which, but I think the Theravadan is the only remaining of 18 sub-schools of one of those. That's the one that seems to be mainly existing in the world today. The teachings you'd receive in Burma or Thailand, for example. So all of those are shared. Those teachings are the very teachings we study in the first and second levels of the Lam Rim. That we share those teachings because they're all part of Lord Buddha's teachings. And so another analogy here, which I always use repeatedly, is this analogy that a bird needs two wings, the wisdom wing and the compassion wing. Well, that whole first two, the teachings of the Theravadan, the teachings of the Hinayana, they are the wisdom wing. So that if you were on that path, you'd graduate at the end there, and your goal would be your nirvana, your own personal liberation from samsara, your individual liberation, as they say, the pratimoksha, the individual liberation. So if you are practicing that path, as you would indeed if you were in Burma or Thailand, your goal is to achieve liberation from suffering and its causes. So the Four Noble Truths is another way of presenting those two scopes, and you'd follow those through. And then that's what your goal would be. But if you're on the Mahayana path, you'd do all of those too, and then you'd go to the third component, the compassion wing, or as I call it, university, or the teachings and practices suitable for the disciple of the greatest capability. And there you add, into the mix, you add the cultivation of bodhicitta. So the very first one, then, of the first two are the goal, as far as we're concerned, on the path to Buddhahood all the way, is the goal isn't liberation. The goal is renunciation of suffering and its causes. So, like I said, if you completed that, you would then add. You do all the things in the Lam Rim, and then you would add to it the achievement of concentration, calm abiding, and then finally using that to realize emptiness. Then you'd achieve your nirvana, and in one life or other you'd complete the path, and then when you die you won't come back. So in the Lam Rim, the things that are covered in these first two sections, junior school and high school, as I call them, are up to shamatha and calm abiding and emptiness. They are not taught there. They're Hinayana teachings in their nature, but Tsongkhapa presents them as the fifth and the sixth of the six perfections of the Bodhisattva. So we leave those until later. And Tsongkhapa has his own reasons for that, And that's the Lam Rim that we're covering here, the first stages are the essence of the very first one. The essence of those the teachings are the teachings on karma, the teachings on cause and effect. That's the culmination of junior school. So as we know, with the Lam Rim, the very entry point, the preliminary thing to think about is you've got this precious human rebirth, because Tsongkhapa or a teacher wants us to get a wake-up call, not to waste this precious life. Then we enter into the path, and the first thing we're going to hear are Buddha's extensive teachings about impermanence, but not subtle impermanence, which is actually quite advanced and which can be confused with emptiness, in fact. And but no, he wants to increase our wake-up call, and he wants us to think about impermanence of this person, death, which is why he teaches death at that point, not just impermanence in general. His agenda is to give us a wake-up call. Then, as we know, from there, we then think about the likely types of rebirth that we would have. So that increases our wake-up, and we hear about the suffering realms, and that increases our wake-up call, not to waste this precious life. And then we think, well, whom can we turn to give us methods to stop that suffering? So here we turn to Buddha, and we learn about refuge. And then finally, we then ask Buddha, please give us the methods to get the hell out of samsara, please, which is the point. And that's where he teaches about karma. So here, what's interesting, this is the point I want to talk about. So the essence of the first scope, the first stages of the path, is to abide by the laws of karma. Everything leads to that. That's the actual practice. That's where you begin to practice. Hearing about impermanence, hearing about the lower realms, hearing about refuge kind of prepares your mind to now begin to actually practice, quitting the causes of suffering, But the point here I want to make, and this is what's interesting, I mean, when we hear that, we just hear about karma. Okay, great, karma, wonderful. Don't do this and don't do that and do this and do this and blah, blah. But the real point I'm trying to get to here is that karma, the more we learn to abide by the laws of karma, which many Buddhists don't even like, they don't even think about it. I think it's not even relevant. What are you even talking about karma for? It's just because we hear it as just like heavy duty. Buddha saying, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. And we hear it in the same way we've heard our Christian teachings, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, because if you do, you're naughty and you get punished. We hear it that way, but we mishear it utterly and completely. So when we do hear it properly, it's really an amazing way to learn to become responsible, because it's actually karma, the law of cause and effect. The more broad law is the law of cause and effect, which is the most basic law that is what drives the universe as far as Buddha is concerned. And cause and effect is one of the is a brilliant karma is a brilliant example of the first level of dependent arising, which we're going to get to in the compassion wing, in the bodhisattva path, in the final stages. It's a brilliant example of dependent arising. In other words, the explicit teaching about karma is to don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Why? You should ask Buddha. What's his reason? He will tell you, because that will program your mind with those tendencies, and that will cause you future suffering. So, honey child, if you don't want future suffering, forget the lower realms, but if you don't want to be killed, lied to, stolen from, harmed, be sick, be poor, people be mean to you. Do you want that suffering, Robina? No, thank you. Well, honey child, this is your method. Stop causing it. But this is the explicit teaching. But when we start to take that on board and really start to hear it with Buddhist ears, then it really does learn. It enables you to literally become more responsible, become more accountable, to become less of a victim. You blame people less, you take responsibility more, and it helps you loosen the grip of ego grasping. It's a really good example, but that's not the explicit reason. It's not the explicit teaching. The explicit teaching in karma is to protect yourself from future suffering. So it's not evident to us that it can help us realize emptiness. But like I said before, when we understand the entire path, every step of the way is leading you to realize emptiness. It's priming your mind. So this is a perfect example of how that happens right at the beginning stages. So I want to look at that. Let's look at that. But before that, I want to talk about karma. Why not get it clear? And again, this is my point about how we so mishear Lord Buddha's teachings, because if we've come from a Christian background, or a Jewish background, or indeed a Muslim background, that all share the one view of a creator. We know perfectly well that's the key point, one of the main points in which Buddha diverged from the Hindus before him, these genius Indian scholars and yogis who indeed also talked about karma, but they absolutely posit an energy called a God, that is intrinsic, inherent, permanent, uncaused, that is the source of the entire universe and of me and of everything else. And that is a view that we know very well if we've been brought up as a Christian. So naturally, we hear karma with the same ears as a Christian would. And that's why it's not spelled out for us by the Buddhists, because they're talking, like I said, they're talking to the choir. All the Buddhists, the Tibetans who hear the teachings about karma already understand there's no creator. But we make this big mistake of hearing it with those ears, which really makes a mess of the understanding of karma. In other words, we don't really understand it properly, and this is the crucial thing we need to point these things out to ourselves if we like being a Buddhist. We've got to really spell it out so so clearly, because this is the Buddha's teachings. So, okay, Jesus, I always say, Jesus has his little list of 10 don'ts, and they sound just like Buddha's. Almost the same. Don't kill, don't steal, don't jump on the wrong partner, don't lie. You know, I don't know exactly what they all are, but they're very similar. So, of course, we can hear them in the same way. And so then, but the reasoning is completely different. And we've got to understand this if we want to apply karma properly. And most of us as Westerners, we don't. We don't hear karma properly, which is why it doesn't really help us loosen the grip of ego. It increases it, you know. So this is the thing. I always quote this, always tell this because it's a really good point. I asked my Jesuit priest friend years ago. I said, basically I said, why does Jesus say, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie? In other words, how do Christians define something as a negative action, or as they call it, a sin, you know? How would you define a sin? Why? In other words, why is it wrong? And we all need to ask that question. We probably mostly don't. We go, oh, well, it just, shouldn't kill, shouldn't lie, just because, we don't really analyze it. But we must analyze it. We must think about it. We must ask the question. If someone suggests you don't kill, you should ask them why not. You must. Don't just accept it. That's foolish. So obviously, if you're a Christian, as he said, by definition, a sin, that is to say, killing, for example, is doing what God said you shouldn't do. Now, I'm not criticizing that view. If you want to have faith in a creator, please, you'll live a good life, You'll be happy if you really have a faith in a creator. Meaning, they're the ones who run the show, they created all the rules, they created you, and so, of course, they've got to be obeyed. It's obvious. It goes without saying. And that's unfortunate. And so then, of course, the logic is, if you go against God's will, you will be punished. And that's how we hear karma so clearly. We never think for 1 second that it doesn't mean that. We are so neurotic when it comes to karma. We hear it exactly like that, When we hear about vows, we hear it as someone sitting on top of us, squashing us. Don't do this, because we hear the rest of it. If you do, you'll get punished. So we've got to think that through. Because in Buddhism, there's no such concept as a creator. We have to really think this through and really listen to it carefully, because it's completely different. So if you ask Buddha, why do you suggest I don't kill? He does not say, because I say so, which is what God says. It's because I say so. But Buddha, that's a joke. It's ridiculous. That's like thinking you go to your doctor and she says, don't smoke. And she answers, because I say so. And if you smoke, Robina, I will punish you with cancer. We would laugh at that. But that's how we hear about morality and ethics, isn't it? Which is just infantile. And it's not even what Buddha's saying. But you hear it this way. And we can be forgiven for hearing it this way, because Tibetans sound very fundamentalist, I tell you, even though there's no creator. They're kind of like, you listen to Lama Zopa teach, I tell you, it's like hellfire and brimstone. We know that. But there's no concept as a creator. So then what does it mean then, if that's the case? What is the reason for not killing? Well, this is the point. So for the Buddha, there are 2 points to get clear. He says, first, a negative action, this type of negative, they call it natural negativity. There's no equivalent to God's law. In Christianity, it's called God's law. Well, of course, Buddha has got lots of instructions that aren't what they call natural negativities, like killing, stealing, lying. For him, the logic of calling killing a negative action is because sentient beings don't like getting harmed. That's what a natural negativity is. It's an action that harms a sentient being. And that's what he calls one. So the Catholic priest told me there's some, in saying that killing is wrong, there is some component of its being natural law, that people don't like getting killed. But the main thing that makes it wrong is because God said. I mean, that's necessary to understand, but that's how we hear Buddhism. It's so mistaken. Buddha is not a creator. He is not, therefore, a punisher. There is no such concept of a punisher or a rewarder, because there is no creator. We've got to think these things through, not just say, oh yeah, no creator. You've got to analyze it. You've got to see the experiential implication of that. So this is the point. When we get this clear, then we're going to be incredibly grateful to the Buddha, just like to your doctor who says don't smoke, and you're saying why not, and then she will show you a video of someone's cancerous lungs. Then you are so grateful when she says, if you smoke, Robina, you'll end up with this terrible suffering and you'll die. You don't say, how dare you tell me I'll die? We don't feel threatened. We are grateful to her. But when we hear Lama Zopa tell us that if we kill, you go to the hell realms for 42 eons, we just hear it as a punishment. But no one's punishing you. You do it yourself, baby. That's the thing to hear. And that's the real point I'm getting to. When we start to apply karma properly, thinking it through like this, you choose. Buddha's making a recommendation like a good doctor. And you then decide, I'd like to take that advice. Because why, Robina? Because I'm taking as my working hypothesis that my actions of body, speech, and mind will produce my future. So in a sense, as His Holiness says, karma is like self-creation. So when we hear that, everything changes in our mind and we start to hear it completely differently. We happily only want to abide by the laws of karma because we don't want future suffering. We get that in the West when it comes to nutrition or health. You're not ashamed to say, no, I will not eat sugar because you don't want future suffering. You will not smoke because you don't want future suffering. We are rigorous and so disciplined when it comes to what we put into our mouth because we know we want to be healthy. But when it comes to morality and ethics, we just get full of guilt and all twisted and miserable and neurotic and angry and depressed. I mean, we are just ridiculous, But it's very ingrained in us. This dualistic view that believes in an intrinsic me is full of fear and guilt and shame and neurosis. So we just add to our misery when we hear about karma, and we just don't hear it properly. I mean, that's why when we do the purification practice, the very first step is regret. Well, as His Holiness says, we just hear it as guilt. I did this and I did that, and we conclude that I'm a bad person. That's how we hear it. I remember a friend of mine who teaches Buddhism. He said he hears it when he says regret, he says to himself, I shouldn't have done that, and I shouldn't have done that, and I shouldn't have done that. That's absurd. Shouldn't have is just anger, like your mother shouting at you. You shouldn't have done that. It's just saying angry. It's just anger. That's how that's guilt. It's just completely irrational. So we've really got to think it through. But it takes a lot of mental effort because we are so addicted to this dualistic view about punishment and reward and I'm bad and guilt and all the rest. It's very ingrained. Don't blame your Jewish mother or your Catholic mother. They don't need to teach us about guilt. Already having ego grasping, already believing in an intrinsic me brings that response, which is how we hear the view of karma, like punishment and reward. We do it to ourselves. We do that negative view to ourselves, but the key point is Buddha says we create ourselves. They don't say it like that in the Lam Rim. I promise you won't hear them say it that way. This is using modern language because then we can understand it, And when they teach karma in the Lam Rim, it's straight into the deep end. The assumption being that the people hearing it, that is Tibetans and Indians, already accept the view of karma, And this is where if we don't understand karma properly, it just increases our delusions, increases attachment, it increases anger, it increases blame and guilt. And that's why most Westerners, many people who aren't necessarily, let's say, Tibetan Buddhists, well, no, we know in Tibetan Buddhists go on, they study the teachings a lot. In some traditions, like in the Zen tradition, they wouldn't even talk about karma, And some people who hear about it for the first time just think it's a completely irrelevant philosophy. Who cares, But so it takes a while to really hear it properly. And so as far as Buddha's concerned, it's the very first teaching. It's where you begin to put your money where your mouth is to stop causing your own future suffering. That's the very first thing you have to do. And karma in the main teachings in the beginning, in the very first scope of the Lam Rim, it's all to do with your body and your speech. It's not even to do with your mind yet. You've got to wait till you get to the second part of the lamb rim. You've got to wait till you get to the high school, to the middle scope, before you start listening to about teaching about the mind. Here in the very first level, it's control the servants of your mind. It's control your body and your speech. You discipline your behavior. It's all about behavior. And then you take vows, which I want to talk about. And that's all about behavior as well. Mostly vows are not to do with the mind. It's about controlling your body and your speech. And in our world, in a modern world, I think in a modern one, we think about spiritual practice. We don't think of, we think, oh, I want to meditate, and that's middle scope. That's high school. That's more advanced. It's logical that if you can't control your mouth, if you just vomit out the anger, how on earth can you control your mind, which drives the speech, So it's so logical, this very first level of practice, which is really like a preliminary practice to really begin to get to the middle scope, where you even then really begin to even be a Buddhist. Abiding by the laws of karma is you start to act. But even that, ethics is a thing shared by anybody. There's no karma's Buddha's particular view about ethics, but the general approach of the first scope, which is ethics, is shared by good communists, good Christians, and good Muslims. That's nothing special. So you only really become a real Buddhist when you get to the middle scope and you start working on your mind, using Buddha's very specific approach to the mind. And that's what I want to get to, later, now and half of tomorrow. Maybe we do all this today, and then tomorrow we can just focus on dependent arising, yeah. So the middle scope, so here we are in the first scope. You're priming your mind, perfect human rebirth, death, lower realms, refuge. Now you're ready to actually start to abide by the laws of karma, and that's where you begin to practice. So the best way to do that, of course, is to take vows. So I think just here the main point I want to make here is that it's a brilliant example of cause and effect. Many things are cause and effect. Everything's cause and effect. Plants, and there's many kinds of causes and effects, but the cause and effect here we're discussing that's unique to the Buddha is that what goes on in your mind and what your body and speech do on the basis of that. That's the very process that produces the person you become. So broadly speaking, within cause and effect, your mother and your father, what they do to you, that's also one of the causes, but they're only secondary causes. As far as the Buddha is concerned, the main cause, the primary cause, the first cause of what happens to you, who you become in the future, is your actions of body and speech, then based on your mind. So this is the real powerful point about karma being a brilliant example of cause and effect, and cause and effect being the first of the three levels of dependent arising that Lord Buddha teaches us, which we're starting to get into. So now let's leap to dependent arising. Now go to the great scope. We'll go more into that tomorrow. So how then does abiding by the law of karma, how does it help me loosen the grip of ego? Let's try and spell it out. Because if we hear it only as punishment and reward, it doesn't help at all. In fact, it increases ego. It increases neurosis, because you live in fear and guilt and more blame and more depression and more anxiety. It's completely neurotic. But if you hear karma properly, that Buddha's kind instruction based on his own direct experience, that the main cause of who I am now is my past actions of body, speech, and mind, and the main cause of who I will become are the actions of my body, my speech, and my mind. This is the point about karma. And so what that does is it puts us in the driving seat. Whereas now, with the view of ego, with the view of I, as far as we are concerned, especially if we have the materialist philosophical view, which prevails in our world, if we have the view, which most of us take as a given, without question, that our mother and father make us, literally produce the person called Robina. Without analysis, that is exactly what we think, that there's no Robina before the egg and sperm come together. There's no Robina-ness. So what Robina is the product of mummy's and daddy's egg and sperm. We don't posit anything called a mind that's separate from the brain. So therefore, so logically, your mother and your father do give you a brain and do give you DNA and they do give you genes and they do give you a body. But the Buddha's saying, honey child, that's just the physical. The main part of you is your mind, and that cannot possibly come from your parents. That's like the biggest joke for the Buddha. Nor is there any component of you that comes from a creator. So you could argue that the dualistic view, that at least that the Christian view, for example, and the materialist philosophical view share, is that you are the handiwork of someone else. I mean, for the Buddha, this is a schizophrenic idea, and I'm not being sarcastic. It's a demented view that actually we believe, and we believe it totally in the modern world. This is this that runs our psychology, it runs our neuroscience, it runs all the views of we are totally, all the views that we have. My mother and my father literally are the main cause of who I am. So therefore, they're the main cause of my anger, the main cause of my depression. They gave me anger. They gave me depression. They gave me the tendency to jump on little girls. They gave me the tendency to be good at music or football. So as far as we're concerned, we're the handiwork of our mummy and daddy. Therefore, it is correct to think, as we do, I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. We joke, but that's exactly the philosophical view of this innocent victim. It's schizophrenic for the Buddha. So that's literally the opposite of karma. But when we hear karma in the wrong way, we hear it like more punishment and reward. So this increases your ego, more guilt, more shame. It's just demented. Whereas the Buddha's view is a revelation. Your mind, your consciousness, this non-physical, continuity of mental moments, is your mind. The previous cause of this moment of my mind is my mind. The previous moment of that mind was my mind. You get back right to the first second of conception. The first second of conception, the egg, where did it come from? The previous second before conception, it was in mummy's body. The sperm was in daddy's body, but where was your mind? That's its own continuity. It's this river of mental moments. It's not too difficult to posit this. That's the view. The previous moment of your mind, it's a continuity of mental moments that go back and back and back and back and back and back and back. And you cannot find a first moment. That would be schizophrenic too. But we all believe there has to be a first moment. Don't be ridiculous. If there's a first moment of my mind, what was the cause of that? That's what the clever little children at school, please miss, who caused God? No, you're not allowed to ask that question. But we all assume there has to be a first moment. That's the exact opposite of the philosophy of cause and effect, which is why it's profound, because it's an example of dependent arising, which proves emptiness. So we've got to think these things through, So the mind is your own. What's in it is yours. You brought it with you. You came fully programmed at the first second of conception in your mother and father's egg and sperm. You brought your mind with you from your past habits. You created the cause, not more than a few weeks before you found your way to your mother's fallopian tube. Your consciousness was in a previous body. At the time you started to die in that body, the karmic seed of non-killing that you had practiced, that was in your bank vault, was triggered. That was the cause of how come you already, at that point, already your mind was programmed to go to your present mother's human womb a few weeks later. You caused it from your non-killing, and you got some intense karmic history with that mother. Second, at the same time as that karmic seed was triggered before you stopped breathing in the past life, the next set of karmic seeds that would produce your personality, to produce your person, your mind itself, got nothing to do with your mother and father. They probably haven't even met yet. And you already are all the karmic seeds already been triggered that will become the personality of you in this life, whether you're Hitler or Mother Teresa. To think that Hitler's Austrian housewife mother was the cause of Hitler is like a complete farce. He brought his own tendencies with him, and we did too. Third, all the karmic seeds also triggered at the time before you stop breathing that would then ripen as what they call your experiences in this life. All the people you meet, how they hate you, love you, harm you, are kind to you, whether bad things happen or good things happen to you. Who are the causes of all of those? Not those people. They're just a secondary cause. It's your own past karma. And the fourth lot of karmic seeds are all the karmic seeds that would cause the type of environment you have, the type of body, whether it's healthy or unhealthy or whatever. So we are literally the creator of ourselves. Our mummy and daddy are just merely catalysts. They kindly give us a body, So knowing that about karma, thinking it through, applying it, practicing 1,000 times a day when things happen, good or bad, as Lama Zopa says, everything is our own karmic appearance. That's completely to do with emptiness. It already triggers emptiness. There's nothing existing out there from its own side. It can't come from its own side, but that's how we think about everything. I'm this innocent victim of that mean boyfriend. I'm also the innocent victim of that delicious chocolate cake. You blame the chocolate cake for making you happy, like you blame the boyfriend for making you suffer. It's the view of an innocent victim. That's the view of ego grasping. That's the view is completely mistaken. The dependent arising completely smashes. So karma is a brilliant example of dependent arising. But you've got to think it through like this. Don't just go, oh yeah, karma. Are we communicating? Okay, so we have now, that was 50 minutes. We have now 40 left. And so I've got to go to the second scope today. Then we'll do the third scope tomorrow. We'll go dependent arising itself tomorrow. Now I need you to ask me some questions for a minute, and then we can go to the second scope and see how learning about the mind completely prepares us to understand emptiness. This is the really delicious piece, the next one. So ask me any questions if you like about karma. I just made it, just about karma specifically, and not about dependent arising. If you have any, otherwise I'll keep going. So now that's the very first scope of the Lam Rim. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Why not? Because, honey child, that'll produce your future suffering. And you don't want suffering, Robina, you're sick of it. That's the energy behind wanting to live in vows, wanting to abide by the laws of karma, So delicious. You want to do it. You are the one, because you're in charge. You're in the driving seat. You know you are the creator of yourself. So of course you're going to take care of yourself. How could you bear to think you're going to cause yourself future suffering? You can't bear the thought of it. That's what will drive your wish to abide by the laws of karma. It's empowering, not guilt, not shame, not bad. This is so ridiculous, So now the next level, go to the second scope. And now we get to the mind. Here is where we start. So the key teaching here in the Four Noble Truths, the key teaching is to learn about the main source of suffering from the mental point of view. The main cause of suffering, the very first level, is your actions of body and speech. So then we have to ask, well, what drives the actions of killing, stealing, lying, and harming? Well, we have to learn about that. That's the mind. They're just the servants of the mind. So now we get to the second scope, and now Buddha gets us to get in. We hit the nail on the head now. We really get to the point of understanding attachment. So broadly speaking, you can say in the Four Noble Truths, effectively, Buddha is telling us that attachment is the main cause of suffering. So we know very well when we get to the great scope, we're going to get to the dependent arising and emptiness. No, we're going to hear that the root delusion, ignorance, maripa, the clinging to the intrinsic me, that of course is the root cause of suffering. But effectively, attachment in day-to-day life is the cause of suffering in day-to-day life. And to understand this, and to understand in particular, which is now what I want to talk about, in particular, to understand the way the delusions, the afflictions function. This is where now, this is really preparing us to understand dependent arising, to understand to understand emptiness and the mistake, to understand ego grasping, the root delusion. So here we start to become familiar with those ideas when we start to look into attachment and aversion and the other neurotic states of mind. So again, the explicit teaching here, is to see the disturbing character of the, as they call them, the afflictions. And that's why that word is so commonly used. It's the Sanskrit word and the Tibetan word that's translated into English as afflictions. And it's a good word, because if you have an affliction, well, honey child, you're not happy, are you? You've got a problem. You've got suffering of one kind or another. And so, of course, here, the kind of afflictions Buddha's talking about are mental afflictions. That's the thing we've got to understand. We just say, oh, afflictions, I've got an affliction, But I mean, I don't use that word much. I saw that Lama Yeshe never used it much, because I think you can see in our culture, we just don't use it that much. We certainly don't, you don't go to your therapist and say, I've got an affliction. She'll think, what kind of, century are you living in? It's a very old-fashioned word, isn't it? So we know from the Buddhist language, we know afflictions are referring to attachment, aversion, jealousy, but it's kind of got this odd flavor, and we don't hear it properly. So really, for me, the term that is so accurate, so bullseye in the West for mental affliction, it's called mental illness. I know we laugh at that. Nobody wants ever to admit, well, actually these days we kind of wear our badge of mental illness quite, because there's so many, PTSD and AUD and OCD, wherever, oh, I've got OCD, we'll say. Oh, I've got ADHD, oh, I've got post-stress traumatic this and that. We do wear them like a badge now, because then we feel, well, it's not my fault. We kind of feel like it's getting me off the hook. So that's really this is the most appalling, again, this is the guilt-laden approach we have deep in our bones that prevent us from taking responsibility and being accountable for our body, speech, and mind. Because we're so addicted to finding something out there that is the cause of why I'm this way. So when we hear that we've got OCD or ADHD or PTSD or whatever one we've got, I'm not being sarcastic, the feeling we have is, or bipolar, personality disorder, whatever, we hear all those things, and then we kind of have a feeling, oh, now I understand why I do these dumb things. And then we feel, well, it's not my fault. It's my brain. It's not my fault. Oh, I've got this PTSD. It's not my fault. That's how we hear it, because we are so desperate. Because ego, the irony of ego is we feel guilty. The irony of ego is we feel somehow that we have to get off the hook. We have to find something that gets us off the hook. Ego is desperate to be found to be innocent. That's why innocent victim. Lama Yeshe would call ego the self-pity me, And it sounds very cruel, but it's really, really true if we look at it. And this is why we can't bear to hear Buddha's teachings, because it just sounds like he's blaming me. It's all my fault. You mean it's my fault? Oh, I caused my own suffering, did I? That for us is unbearable. We can't hear it properly for this reason. Because we are addicted to thinking our mother and father made us. Therefore, it's their fault. It's my grandfather's fault. It's the genes' fault. It's my brain fault. Even I remember recently, Oprah in the States. She's always into going on diets and losing weight. And she was on the Weight Watchers board at some point, and they've gone broke now. Because who wants to watch your bloody weight when you just take an injection, isn't it? It's so much easier. Anyway, she always losing weight and talking about her losing weight. Nothing wrong. We're all like that. But recently, I remember she did a big talk about Ozempic. That one, I don't know. I mean, you pay $1,000 a month, I think, for all the rich people. And for New Zealanders, it's like $2,000 nearly, isn't it? To get this needle in your vein so you can lose weight. I mean, it sounds great. But anyway, I remember she was talking, and the way she talked, I was so shocked. I thought she was quite conscious. She said, "Oh, it's not our fault. It's our brain." As if your brain isn't you. Whose brain is it? Holy Mother. So someone's put a stranger's brain in your brain? I mean, I was so shocked because she was sounding like it's not my fault. It's just my brain. I mean, I thought she was quite conscious, and she is, but I was very shocked by that. Oh, poor me, it's not my fault, it's my brain, you know. I can't help it. Shove the cake in. So this whole way ego talk is this is how we think about ego. We know that. But as soon as we hear ego, we feel embarrassed and guilty, and it's not fair, you know. So this is what, and that's not because you're Jewish mother and your Catholic mother. It's because that's the function of all these neuroses. They are schizophrenic in their nature. They are fear-based in their nature. They're I-based, fear-based, neurotic. So we've got to unpack these things. We've got to unpack karma. And now we get to the mind, which is a really bullseye. So let's look at this one, because this is what really prepares us to be able to understand the way the root delusion, marigpa, ego grasping, the way it functions to cause us suffering. And therefore, we can understand how dependent arising counteracts it, and therefore, we can understand how it helps us understand emptiness. It's logical. So again, this is not explicitly taught in the middle scope. What's explicitly taught in the middle scope is the afflicted aspect of attachment and anger. So as we all know, the three poisons, right? We love that phrase, the three toxic emotions. So again, hearing it with Western ears or modern ears, it just sounds like these three random weird things called ignorance, attachment, anger. Why these three, we think? But the more we understand Buddha's view of the mind, which I'm going to be discussing, the more this makes sense, you know. So there's a hierarchical relationship between those three. So ignorance, the root one, is marigpa. It means literally ignorance, unawareness. So obviously in Buddha's teachings there's many levels of ignorance. One type of ignorance is the ignorance of karma. In fact, they say the bodhisattvas have the greatest compassion for us because we have that particular ignorance, not understanding cause and effect. Forget emptiness, you know. So, but this ignorance, but the root ignorance, as we know, this marigpa, the root one is the ignorance in the mind that clings to, believes in a real, concrete, solid, intrinsic, inherent, definite, pointable, findable me, set in stone. That is completely in our bones. Our mother does not teach us that. Mice and dogs and ants and hell beings all have it. It's the root delusion such that when you've uprooted it by realizing emptiness, that's when you're the hell out of samsara, you know, because it's the most primordial. So then that ignorance, this primordial feeling of being, especially being a separate, bereft, lonely, cut off, isolated, miserable, set in stone me. And what it then gives rise to, the main voice of this ego grasping is a good colloquial term for this marigpa, this ignorance. This ego grasping, its main voice is attachment. Well, you know, I mean, since I first studied, I was so fortunate to study, Lama Yeshe started what he called the Geshe program. This is in the late 70s when I met the Lama. I met the Lamas in Chenrezig Institute in 1976, and then I became a nun a year later, and then I had to start working for Wisdom, and Lama sent us off to the north of England, to the big centre there. And then Lama sent Geshe Tekchok to one of his colleagues from Serajay to lead what Lama called the Geshe program. He started that in about 1979 or 1980. When I became a nun, I knew I wanted to be a nun as soon as I met the Lamas. And I knew, but I didn't want to meditate. I thought meditation was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. Sitting down with your eyes closed, being quiet. I thought, what a dumb idea, you know. I had no interest in that. But I did want to know my mind. I liked the Buddhist view of the mind, but I wanted to do things, right? So when I went to the center, Lama sent Wisdom Publications there. So I had the job of doing the production, the editing, and I loved doing things. I liked editing and publishing all my life. It's what I've done. I remember this first year when Lama sent this Geshe to teach this Geshe program. There were about 80 people at the center. It was a very intense place. Very amazing center, very incredible. And I remember I'd working at Wisdom, had my office typing and all the work all day, editing and running, dealing with the printer and making the books and blah, blah, blah. and even put them in the very first book we did. I remember at Christmas, Silent Mind, Holy Mind. I put a bunch in our suitcase and I went up to London on the train and sat and flogged them around the shops. I remember I even did that, I think. I remember that when we first started. Anyway, whatever. But this, I'd go to lunch while I was doing wisdom and I'd look at all these people studying this Geshe program, all talking this weird word. I thought, what the hell are they talking about? You know, these people, what are they going on about? What do you mean philosophy? What do you mean study? I had no concept. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know, I promise you, I didn't know what it meant to study the Dharma. I just knew I wanted to do things and I wanted to know my mind. That I knew. And I didn't want to meditate. But then the second year I heard one of the topics I was studying, and then something rang a bell, some karma ripened. It was called Dura, Collected Topics. So anyway, I went to the Geshe Tech Talk, and they were studying 5 days a week, really intense. I said, oh, can I come to some of the classes? I'm really busy, you know, but can I come? He said, you can come. So all I know is when I first went to my first class with my notebook and pencil, they said you had to take notes. And Dura, Collected Topics, is the first text you study in the monasteries. And it's like all the nuts and bolts of Buddhist view, cause, effect, 7 of this, 5 of this, mind, this. And all I know is the first class, and I sat down, it was like finally I discovered what I wanted since I was born. Even when I heard the Lam Rim from Lama Zopa, it didn't do it for me. I didn't get it, you know. I just knew I liked this Buddhism. I liked it. I wanted to become a nun, you know. But that's when I heard those teachings from Geshe Tech Talk, I completely blissed out. I can't tell you. So I did 2 years of study, just 2. It's my greatest regret this life, not doing more study. I studied Dura, and I'm coming to my point. Lorig, about the mind, this is my coming to the point now, Lorig, and the other 2 were logic and another one, the Buddhist tenets. 4 texts in 2 years. I did exams, I got top marks. I'd never studied in my life. I left school when I was 15. I never studied anything, and I finally found what my mind wanted. I can't tell you, I was in complete bliss. But what I'm getting at is, then Lama Zopa 10 years later told me to teach. I was so shocked. I was really shocked. I was shocked when he said I had to teach, you know. It was at Mahamudra Center. 1987. I'd been working for Wisdom Publications for 10 years and I lost my job. I got sacked from most of my empty jobs. I'm happy to confess. And it was time to go, so I lost the job. It doesn't matter. And I did a retreat with Lama Zopa, Palgan Hlamo retreat, 1987, near Mahamudra. And Lama Ursal was there. He was about 2, and he'd come every day. And I remember I did that retreat. I was so happy because I'd finished my job at Wisdom. And then I didn't know what I was going to do. So then Lama Zopa called me up at the house, you know, upstairs. You're staying upstairs. And he called me up. And I always think of it as Michelangelo, that big painting of God with a finger, you know, pointing to God creating the world. I always have a vision of it. And Lama Zopa said, go to Sydney and teach. I was very shocked, you know. I don't think the centre even needed a teacher, but he told me to go to Sydney and teach. So I didn't know I was qualified. I was really nervous. I thought, what if I run out of words? I was really nervous. And then I thought, I had 2 fears. I'd be nervous and I'd run out of words. So then I decided I'll teach is that I'm talking to one person, because you don't get nervous when you talk to one person. And second, if I run out of words, I'll go, any questions? And that's exactly what I do still, 40 years later, nearly 40 years later. Anyway, what I'm getting at is I'd learned this stuff in these texts. I'd studied Lorig, and it was very bare, you know, all this conceptual stuff. But any words, all I'm getting at is any words I say now about the mind, which is the topic we're on to now in the middle scope, it's from what I studied, you know. And for me, it is just, and every time I talk about it, I kind of feel like a fraud because all I ever talk about. I think someone's going to catch me out one day and know that I'm just keep repeating the same thing, which I do. But every time I say it, I hear it a bit deeper myself, you know, so I'm always happy to say it. So thank you for listening, but I'm hearing it, I promise. So the point about the mind, this is the point about the Buddhist view of the mind. And this is the point here in the middle scope. When we get this is when we're really prepared to hear about ignorance and emptiness, I promise you. Your mind's ready. And that is to know how the mind functions, you know. So Buddha's talking about the mind. So here in the middle scope, the explicit teaching is on the afflicted, painful aspect of attachment, that being the one that would then want you to give it up because you're sick of the suffering. But there's another characteristic. One is its suffering, distressing, disturbing nature. They even call it attachment and aversion, and the others disturbing emotions. It's very true. They are absolutely disturbing emotions. And the main point in the middle scope is to try and a teacher wants us to realize how painful they are. So then you only want to give them up. But the other thing that you also start learning, the thing that's implicit, that's the really powerful one, is when you understand how the afflictions function. And that's indicated by this other word that I much prefer to use, and I notice Lama Yeshe only ever used this one, and that's the word delusion. So we hear it in a very wishy-washy way in Buddhism. Oh, we think illusory, illusion, delusion. We don't really understand what it means, but it's got a really precise meaning. And I swear to you, when you understand the meaning of delusion, you will how attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, and all the other neuroses, other afflictions, are delusional in their nature. This is how you will then understand how to break down maripa, ignorance, and realize emptiness. I promise. So what does it mean that these emotional afflictions are delusional? Or they are themselves delusion. The noun delusion. Jealousy is a delusion. They are the branch delusions, but learning in the middle scope about these branch delusions, there's no discussion yet about the root delusion, but this aspect is preparing us to understand the root delusion when we get to dependent arising and emptiness. That's when they go on about it. So what that means is this, and this is the part that's a revelation, and this is when we can understand why they cause us suffering, why they're disturbing. It takes time. So how is attachment a delusion? In other words, how does it cause? So, okay, what is a delusion? You know yourself if someone accuses you, and this is a very good word in English. I know in Spanish and Italian and French, they don't use this word much. It's kind of weird, but we understand it in English. If someone accuses you of being delusional, we know they're accusing you of not being in touch with reality. We know that. That's what it means psychologically, isn't it? Oh, she's delusional. She thinks she's Mozart. But this is a brilliant point. When you know, we mightn't think we're Mozart, but this is what Buddha's telling us. Attachment, for example, the one that's the main cause of day-to-day suffering, it is a conceptual state of mind, and we're going to go into that exaggerates the deliciousness of the object. Now, anger is a conceptual state of mind that exaggerates the ugly qualities of something. Pride is a conceptual state of mind that exaggerates your importance. Low self-esteem is a conceptual state of mind that exaggerates your ugliness, your horrible qualities. So the key characteristic, precisely, in detail, the key characteristic of these afflictions is that they, as Lama Zopa says, they cause what's on the outside world, the boyfriend, the cake, the event, to appear back to you wrongly. So it's like, it's sort of like, it's obvious, but we don't join the dots. So when there's enormous attachment for just a piece of chocolate cake, okay, attachment's multifaceted, but I'm talking to this particular point of it. There's other aspects as well, but this is the bullseye job of attachment. When it's in the mind, when it's predominant in your mind, that literally causes the cake to look way more delicious than it actually is. And when you are angry with your boyfriend, let's say, or somebody, that anger in your mind causes that person to appear way more ugly than they actually are. Now, we know this when it comes to the same person. Oh, no, even forget the person. Look at the chocolate cake. It is so evident. So at the beginning, when your stomach's empty and your mind's all excited And you've got the more deep emotional component of attachment is this emotional neediness, this emotional hunger, this feeling of dissatisfaction, this feeling you haven't got enough, this feeling of something's missing. All of that is the energy of attachment. But what it causes then is this incredible hunger, believing totally that that cake will make the pain go away. So because of the habit of attachment, it's actually misrepresenting the cake to you. And we know that. And this is helping us understand emptiness. It's really obvious. Because the cake appears, doesn't it, way more delicious. It appears so delicious, like it's vibrating deliciousness. And this is also the point. It feels like it's all coming from the cake. This is where it really is literally talking the way emptiness talks. The cake appears to be totally out there on the plate, totally delicious, and poor, bereft, hopeless, nothing me here is just desperate to get that cake in the mouth because convinced it's going to make me happy. We're convinced it will make the pain go away. That's how it feels. So that we know is a lie, because then you eat the cake, you have your first mouthful, and what happens is, dissatisfaction's still there, anticipation is there now, attachment's sitting there, all anticipating, excited to wait for the pleasure to come. The pleasure does come. A moment of pleasure definitely comes, but as you put the cake in the mouth, attachment, the second before the cake is in the mouth, the anticipation of attachment is multifaceted. The emotional hunger, the anticipation is waiting for that pleasure to come. The pleasure comes, but what happens the second you start chewing the cake and it triggers the pleasant feeling, attachment is like disappointed. Oh, that's not enough, Robina. You need to have a second mouthful. I'm not happy yet. So attachment is this bottomless pit of dissatisfaction. It's a bottomless pit of emotional hunger, and it can't be satisfied, but it believes the cake will bring me satisfaction. So attachment is multifaceted, but the key function I'm bringing out here, the key function, the bare bones function, that is even in the definition of attachment. Attachment is a conceptual thought that exaggerates the deliciousness of, in this case, the cake. So it seems weird to call it a conceptual thought. And that's another point that is vital to understand in the Buddhist model of the mind. That we've got sensory consciousness, and then we have mental consciousness, which is all the thoughts and feelings and emotions. So then within the mental consciousness, we know we've got all the intellectual thoughts. They don't seem like, they're not emotional, are they? Intellectual thoughts about maths and music and content, clever thoughts. Then you have the emotions, and we point here, but they're also conceptual thoughts. We live at the level of conceptuality. We live at the level of conceptuality at our mental level. But they also have the emotional component. And why they have an emotional component, why the conceptual thought called attachment that exaggerates the deliciousness of the cake is so emotional, is because we've practiced it and practiced it and practiced it and believed in it for countless lifetimes. And so it's totally automatic. It's totally second nature. It's totally primordial. So beyond conceptual, it's like a joke, but it's rooted in being a conceptual thought that we have practiced believing in for eons. Eons in all the realms of existence. So this component, this conceptual component of of exaggeration, that's the thing that when we get it is the revelation that enables us to understand why attachment, anger, jealousy causes so much pain. And it leads us to understand the root delusion that exaggerates the very ontological status itself of the very delicious cake, of the very I, and of everything else. And so this leads us to help to understand dependent arising and emptiness. Okay. The key thing here then to understand is how it's conceptuality. Because we just think of it as an emotion. We think of it even as physical. But the only reason this is our trouble in our culture. You see, our trouble is because we don't pay attention to our mind, our thoughts, until they're screaming, until they're emotional, until your body's shaking. We don't even notice our thoughts until the body's involved, and that's when the emotions are involved because our body gets involved. And this is very helpful when we understand the Vajrayana model, how we have these subtle physical energies, the subtle wind energies coursing through our subtle central, or our nervous system, combined with our states of mind. So when the attachment mind is there, the wind energies are berserk. So your mind's shaking. That's why you get anxiety and panic attacks. When you're angry, look at a person when they're angry. There's conceptual thoughts, but because they've practiced anger for so long, they're having a mental breakdown, screaming and yelling and shouting and spit coming out of their mouth and their eyes wide, and they punch and want to kill because the body is completely overwhelmed. But it's mental. Anger is not a function of the body. Attachment is not a function of your tongue. Attachment is not a function of your sensory consciousness. It can't be. Attachment is a conceptual thought. It's mental consciousness. These are what you learn in low rig. Then it gives us a basis, a logical basis for understanding these states of mind. Are we communicating, people? Now I need you to ask me some questions. And then tomorrow we'll go to the third scope and we'll discuss dependent arising and emptiness itself. Any questions, people, sweethearts, anything at all? Yes, go, Rebecca.
I'm not sure it's a question. You're absolutely fascinating. You are making clear to me so many things I have not had any grasp of at all. So thank you.
Wonderful.
And what you're saying is making so much sense. But then you talk about eons and eons of practicing these things, and that scares the crap out of me.
I know.
I've been doing it for eons.
No, I know. See, darling, the main thing for me there is, is really to point out why they're so deep, why they're so instinctive, and why it takes so long. Because we know ourselves. Our mother didn't have to teach us to have attachment. Our mother didn't have to teach us. This stuff is just totally primordial. So we've got to.
She gave us the first key attachment, isn't it? I mean, that is the primary attachment to our mother, isn't it?
Oh, you mean attachment? You mean?
I mean, the first attachment you have is to the mother. Physically and spiritually.
But the Buddha, even when you look at the Buddha's view of the attachment is the main cause of why you even went to your mother's womb in the first place. It was intense attachment that drove you from your previous life. Then when mummy and daddy hopped into bed, it was intense craving that drew you like a magnet. And that's why to the mother and father. But even more than that, even why this whole realm of existence, Buddha calls all these different realms of existence, including the animals and the other realms, he calls this a desire realm, and that means attachment. So the more we understand karma and how attachment has literally created the way our bodies are, creates the shapes, it creates all the things that we see and hear and taste and touch and smell. It creates this very physical universe. That's over eons, definitely. That's definitely over eons. We can even just use the Western view of history. There's billions of years. This is all the product of human minds, of sentient beings' minds, Buddha says. So from that bigger point of view, it's eons old. Do you understand me? But yeah, of course. Go on. Yes, Rebecca.
When you say all sentient beings, can you just define for me in the Buddhist worldview sentient
Absolutely.
beings?
Yes, I will, exactly. So you could argue the universe consists of two phenomena: matter, which, as they say, is made of the four elements. And that we used to think that way back in Galileo's time, but now certainly still in the Buddhist view, that's the model used. Physical matter, and then there are minds, beings. The term in Tibetan is lovely. It's sem chen, which literally we translate it as sentient being, but it literally is mind possessor. And the Buddha would say there are trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon countless trillions of mind possessors. Humans are a tiny percentage. There's all, even in our realm, we all know the bugs, the creatures, the tiny dust mites. Our body is a walking zoo of sentient beings, the big sentient beings like the elephants and the tiny baby ones. There's a trillion, and they're all consciousnesses like yours that are going back and back and back, taking countless rebirths, driven by ignorance, driven by attachment, driven by delusions, and therefore continually causing themselves suffering.
Are trees sentient beings?
The Buddha would say okay, put it this way. This physical body that we know as Rebecca's, that's the 4 elements, and that tree is the same 4 elements, but that tree is not the physical body of a sentient being. It might be home to millions of sentient beings who live there, but the tree is not conjoined with a mind. Whereas these 4 elements sitting here on that chair there, they are combined with a mind, pervading your body. So that's the difference between
a plant is not sentient, an ocean is not sentient in that way.
Would say, the Buddhist view would say they are not sentient beings. But it's very hard to prove that, because there can be tiny sentient beings that you can't even see with your eye, and there can be things as big as a tree that you can't see that is a sentient being or not, because we're not clairvoyant. Because to see a mind, by definition, a mind isn't physical, so you can't see a mind. So we can only deduce by certain behavior that things are sentient. So of course different people have different views about this, but I'm just quoting the Buddhist view. All right, darling? Thank you. Okay, so go on. Who's there? Guido? Talk to me. Who's talking?
Almost.
Hi, Venerable Christina.
Hello. Hello, sweetheart. Good. Talk to me.
I'm just curious about the subtle impermanence that you mentioned, and that this is not emptiness. Could you say a bit more about that?
Okay, well, I know that, interestingly, I can't remember all the details now, but I remember in when I was studying the Buddhist tenets, all these different viewpoints, and those different schools of thought that they outline in these Buddhist tenets. It's sort of like it's sort of like a book that tells you every single tiny Christian view and all their variations, not exactly like all the Christians and the 47 Protestants and all that. Well, that's what this is, and so they talk about the different viewpoints are taught in terms of first the Hinayana level, then within that there's the Vaibhashika, and then there's a slightly more sophisticated view called the Saitantrika, and then you've got the Mahayana, and within that you've got the Chittamatra, and then the middle way, and then the middle way is divided into these and these. So there's all these variations, and the key things are they're different interpretations of various points, but in particular interpretations of emptiness. That's the key level at which they are different. So they say, I know at one point, I remember talking to one Burmese practitioner. I remember one year in India, I lost my ticket for my train, and so this kind Burmese couple traveling up to Dharamsala offered me to share their cabin on the train. We had very nice talks, and I remember I asked them. I said, well, they talked about impermanence, meditating on impermanence, And I said, when do you learn to start meditating on emptiness? Oh, no, they said, you don't need to do that. It comes naturally. Do you understand? So they said that. So then what I read was, when I was studying those texts, that one of the views of subtle impermanence of one school is the previous school's view about gross selflessness. So it can be confused with the view. There are various levels of emptiness, various levels of selflessness, and it can be confused. You can think you can think that subtle impermanence is actually emptiness because it feels like, because it's so subtle, but it's a brilliant stepping stone to realize. Subtle impermanence is a stepping stone to begin to realize emptiness, because they do these meditations on impermanence. You're watching this moment, and then you suddenly, that leads to the next moment, and it leads to the next moment. Well, when the moment you've got this moment, already it's gone. That's really, in other words, you can't pin it down. And even they talk about time divided into millions of moments. You can't pinpoint. What we want to do is pinpoint something and say, there it is. But even impermanence, you can't do that. The second you grab onto this moment of time, already it's turned into the next moment of time. So it's like you can't find it. And that can be misinterpreted as the meaning of emptiness.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
understand?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you understand? So gross impermanence, which is what a teacher wants us to talk about, is death. That's the evident one, that trees die, people die, tables break. But subtle impermanence is the very coming into existence of something is already the beginning of the end of it. Sort of like that. It's much more subtle and can only be meditated upon at a more subtle level. It can only be realized in subtle meditation. But it can easily be misinterpreted as emptiness. And it's a mistake. The Buddhists, certainly the Prasangika Madhyamika view would say it's a mistake to think that it'll come naturally. Not possible. The mistake is so subtle. That's why you've got to have deep concentration. And that's why you've got to have a lot of hard work to particularly depending on arising, to deconstruct the lie, to realize the lie of how there's no intrinsic I. Because there's many levels of impermanence, many levels of selflessness. That's what the key way that the different views differ is in terms of selflessness, emptiness. And there can be, and the Prasangika Madhyamika is said to be the meaning of Buddha's teachings. There's many, many views, even of emptiness. Do you understand? You understand? And all of you, yeah, and we'll discuss that tomorrow. But you understand, though, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, go on. Yes, sweetheart, talk to me.
Is ego grasping a purely human thing, and also the suffering from it? Does a monkey, a quite intelligent being, does it have ego grasping to some extent?
This ego grasping, this marigpa, this root delusion for the Buddha, is the delusion that keeps all sentient beings from the hell realms to the peak of the formless realm, which is which is liberation for the Hindus. Ego grasping is the one thing that hasn't been removed. So by definition, if you're in samsara, you've got ego grasping, by definition. Yeah.
But let's say a monkey on a monkey rock, right? Another monkey has an object, and the boss monkey wants to have that object. He's attached to it, and he's suffering from wanting to have that object, and might get into a fight and whatever. This is not suffering from ego grasping. This is suffering from a different kind of attachment. So I was just wondering if ego grasping is purely a human form of suffering.
Right. Ego grasping, marigpa, is the root delusion that defines you as being a samsaric being. So if you're a monkey, by definition, you've got ego grasping. You couldn't have attachment if you didn't have ego grasping. You couldn't have anger if you didn't have ego grasping. Ego grasping is the root of all the others. They all come down to ego grasping. There has to be ego grasping there. But it's even for most of us humans, it's not explicit. That's why it's so hard to see it. It's impossible even for us humans to identify it. It's so subtle. So by definition, all sentient beings have it. That's why they're suffering.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Time to go, I think. Is it time to go, Lisa?
Yes, maybe it's time.
Okay. So there's some food for thought. So the summary of what I said then is trying to show how the teachings in the first and second scopes of the Lam Rim, first one, karma, is the implicit teaching that we start to get when we really apply it properly. It helps us realize it's a brilliant example of dependent arising, so it can help us loosen the grip of ego already. And then second, when we get to the middle scope, we start studying the mind, and we start studying how these neuroses, these delusions, these afflictions are these conceptual states of mind that distort and exaggerate the status of things. And that is exactly what we then get to when we start to understand emptiness and dependent arising, and how ego grasping is the kind of, we really start to see how that is the root misconception. So attachment exaggerates deliciousness of the cake. Aversion exaggerates the ugliness of the cake after 5 pieces. And they are both, and all the delusions are rooted in a deepest assumption, which is ignorance, marigpa, that imposes upon the delicious cake inherent delicious cake. that exaggerates the very ontological status of the delicious cake itself. And that's underneath the other delusions. And that's why it's much harder to unpack it. So start with the body and speech, control your body and speech. Then begin to control the branch delusions. And now we're prepared, plus with bodhicitta, and now we begin to be prepared to get to the root delusion, to uproot that by realizing emptiness and getting the hell out of samsara and becoming a Buddha. All right. So we'll do the third scope tomorrow, and we'll get to dependent arising emptiness itself. Okay. Jang Chub Sem Chok Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Guchig Ke Panyampa Me Payang Gong Ne Gonju Pavashog. And may Lama Tsongkhapa come back. He's already, they found him in Nepal somewhere. So maybe soon see his little face and hear his little voice. So he grows up quickly and continues to teach us. Okay. Thank you, sweethearts. Thank you so much all. Looking forward to seeing you in about 22 and a half hours time.
Thank you so much.
Bye, darlings. Bye. Your course notes.
Thank you.
All this stuff I'm talking about is in your course notes, okay? Bye. See you tomorrow.
Bye.